Welcome to Accuracy in Academia's Authors Night. Well, first off, we do these because we try to expose you to those viewpoints and what I find most valuable, the information that goes with them that you wouldn't ordinarily encounter. That's why the last time we looked at outsourcing the U.S. Constitution. Come on in, come on in. Next meeting, November 5th, we'll have Steve Hayward, an American Enterprise Institute fellow, on his masterpiece, The Age of Reagan. If you read no other book on the Reagan years, read that one. It's the best one by far, so far. Also, I must make another public service announcement before we get to our distinguished guest. Our parent organization, Accuracy in Media, is celebrating 40 years of existence, when it was the one and only, and Rita Irvine was the one and only, our founder, critic of the tilt of the media and the story they left out. We'll be celebrating it with a fabulous conference next Friday, October 23rd, free for interns and Capitol Hill staffers, and if you can get press passes from us, 9 to 5 at the Omni Showroom. We've got Lamar Smith, we've got John Fund, and of course, Cliff Kincaid, Accuracy in Media's Editor-in-Chief. Tonight, we have Old Home Week, former executive director, my current job title, her former, Leslie Carbone, but it's just one of the things she's done. She was a tax specialist at the Family Research Council. She was also a speechwriter for Elaine Chao. And she knows economics. By the way, we've got an economics textbook coming out. She knows economics like the back of her hand and so many other things and can explain it just so well. And she does something in this book of hers, which I just wanted to show her how heavily I marked up. This book of hers that's vitally needed. What we usually hear when we point out how much government programs cost, how little they do, what we usually get is, don't you care? Well, she helps to answer that question in this book, Slaying Leviathan, the moral case for tax reform. And come on in, John. By the way, speaking of caring, I've often wondered, since I understand the Bible says we have to tithe and give 1/10 of our income to the church and charity, why does the government need more than that? I'm going to let Leslie answer that question. Leslie Carbone. Wait a minute.
Thanks, Mel. Does the sound work? Okay. Okay. Thanks, Mel, for that great introduction. And I want to thank the Fusco Foundation for generously supporting lectures like these through Accuracy in Academia's Conservative University program. It is a great pleasure to be speaking to an AIA group once again. It's been quite a few years since I had the privilege of serving in the job that Mal now has, Executive Director. And it's still one of the best jobs I ever had, and where I met many people who are still among my friends, including my friend Dave Almasi, who's sitting right here. In fact, just a couple of months ago, I attended the wedding reception of Christy Irvine Tidwell, the daughter of current AIA Chairman Don Irvine, who I'm sorry couldn't be here tonight with us. It was a lovely reception at a Chinese restaurant. And the little favors that they gave guests were these Chinese food containers filled with sweets. Well, of course, there were fortune cookies. But these were special fortune cookies. They were chocolate-dipped fortune cookies. And they were yummy. But I'm sorry to say that the messages weren't always quite as satisfying as the taste of the cookies. And one person at my table got what has got to be the goofiest fortune cookie message ever. It said, "Avoid compulsively making things worse." Well, of course everyone at our table got a big kick out of that. But a few moments later, I found myself thinking, actually, there are a lot of people in our federal government who could benefit from that lesson. Well, the story of my book, Slaying Leviathan, The Moral Case for Tax Reform, is in many ways the story of how the federal government is uncritically, if not compulsively, making things worse through its wealth-spreading fiscal policies. But before we can talk about the myriad ways that government is making things worse, we need to step back and consider what it should be doing in the first place. Now, according to our Declaration of Independence, governments exist to secure people's rights. Now, they wield the power to tax in order to pay for the costs of the vital function of securing our rights. But progressive taxation and redistributionary spending that it supports actually violate our rights. For the state to take from some of its citizens, not because they have broken any natural law, but simply because they have acquired more than others, is to pervert its own function and to misuse for injustice the power that it has been granted to maintain justice. But beyond the affront to justice that this means, this kind of perversion of government's function leads to a number of problems. First of all, it actually diminishes prosperity rather than enhancing it or spreading it. In other words, it makes things worse. But this economic harm is only the beginning. In the natural order, virtue and vice each carries its own consequences. On the one hand, virtue yields largely positive results. Hard work, patience, carefulness, and so forth tend to generate prosperity. Vice, on the other hand, brings negative consequences. Sloth, impatience, recklessness, for example, tend to bring about suffering. By taxing the fruits of the virtuous behavior that creates prosperity, fiscal policy discourages that behavior. In addition, our progressive tax system also takes too much money, not just from the so-called rich, but also from the middle class, diminishing their economic and thus their moral freedom. It unintentionally steers behavior away from virtue. The classic example is, of course, the marriage tax, which encourages not only cohabitation but also divorce and fosters all their attendant social pathologies. And many so-called tax breaks added into the code intentionally steer behavior. The mortgage deduction, for example, seeks to encourage something, home ownership, that we consider to be a mark of a healthy society. But it does so at the cost of encouraging debt. And we've certainly seen over the last year in particular how damaging that can be. But moreover, with these kinds of incentives, the federal government is actually inserting itself into the family's or the individual's decision-making process, usurping the moral authority to decide what's best in their own situation. The government is seizing a moral power that it shouldn't have. And to begin to reverse this, we need, as a citizenry, to think much more deeply and purposefully about what we can and should expect of our federal government. And we must encourage and expect our public servants to do the same. When our collective vision of the proper functions of government becomes so blurry that the state turns into an instrument of injustice, we lose the ability to measure expectations and hold it accountable. And so we must learn once again to hold ourselves and our representatives to the standard of what Republican government ought to be. All the affronts to wisdom, justice, and virtue that I mentioned a few moments ago stem from an incorrect and even foolhardy view of what government can and should do. Government doesn't create prosperity. And when it tries to spread prosperity, it ends up diminishing prosperity. The best it can do is to enforce justice by protecting the rights of the people who create prosperity through work and trade. Now, for purposes of illustration, please just picture with me a very simple society. In this society, there are 3 families. One grows food, one sews clothing, and one builds houses. And those people can create wealth by each doing what they're best at and trading with one another. They don't need government for that. They don't need government to sponsor their creation of wealth or prosperity. When they need government is when one of those family members or someone new comes into the area and tries to steal from or otherwise harm one or more of the honest, hardworking folk. Or when somebody violates a freely agreed upon contractual arrangement. And while they shouldn't have to, unfortunately, these good people have to pay taxes to bring the bad guys to justice. Just as it's more efficient for the family that's better at sewing to buy its food from the family that's better at growing, rather than try to fill both functions itself, it's more efficient for the decent people to create a government to enforce their rights. And although this government doesn't create prosperity, as those people do, it maintains the order that allows them to create it. This is a noble role. When it becomes ignoble, when it abuses its power, is when somebody in the society just decides not to work, not to create something of value that he can exchange with somebody else. Or when he creates something of some value, but not as much as somebody else has created, and therefore doesn't reap as much in reward. And the government seizes wealth from the people who are creating more of it and just gives it to him. It also becomes ignoble when it meddles in the trading relationships that these people undertake, such as when it dictates prices or other terms. Or when it decides that everybody is entitled to things he had nothing to do with producing. For example, deciding that everybody should have a house, whether he's created something of value that he could exchange, either directly or through the medium of money, for a house or not. Now, in addition to perverting its proper role, government is also suppressing prosperity when it does these things. So, when, for example, it's damaged the house building industry so much that it decides that that industry needs to be bailed out, in other words, that the government needs to seize even more of the wealth created by the producers in order to keep that industry afloat, it's moved beyond ignoble into something closer to laughable, if it weren't so tragic. And when it does these things so quickly that even reading the legislation that proposes them, let alone having a robust public debate about it and the principles that it assumes, is impossible, it invites many more of the kind of unforeseen consequences that it's fooling itself into thinking that it's addressing. It is continually making things worse. And while that laughable, tragic, and admittedly oversimplified situation is pretty close to the one we now find ourselves in, we have a lot of reason for optimism. I don't know about you all, but I have grown more hopeful about the future of economic freedom in the last year than at any time in the last 20. The popular outrage, first against the bank bailout, then the auto bailout, then the so-called stimulus package, and now the healthcare power grab, can hearten us all about the prospects for restoring economic freedom and about the moral fiber of the American spirit. People are going to tea parties and speaking out at town halls, and a year ago, I don't think anyone could have predicted the massive size and strength of the 9/12 rally. And many of these people of good character and good conscience are saying that they've become politically involved for the first time. As the Pennsylvania lady told Senator Arlen Specter at his town hall meeting, government has awakened a sleeping giant. But of course, the battle has hardly been won yet. There are still opponents of economic freedom, like my own Congressman, Jim Moran, who famously disparaged those of us who believe in the simplistic notion that people who have wealth are entitled to keep it, or as we selfish simpletons like to think of it, the right to property. George Bernard Shaw famously said that those who rob Peter to pay Paul can always count on the support of Paul. Well, that's true. If Paul is a man of low character and little virtue, it's true if Paul fails to grasp the moral dangers of forcible wealth redistribution. It's true if Paul isn't man enough to be offended by the insult of Big Brother's paternalism. And Big Brother is more likely to get away with such benighted beneficence at Peter's expense if Peter too fails to grasp the moral hazard of wealth redistribution. If his understanding of his own rights is mushy, or if he's simply pessimistic about his ability and that of producers like him to counter government plunder with either persuasive reason or the power of the ballot. And so it's to both Peter and Paul that my book, Slaying Leviathan, hopes to speak. In addition to the moral argument that I've just touched upon, the book also includes a long section on federal spending, primarily to counter the ridiculous notion that we can't afford tax cuts because there's just too much that government simply has to do. There's a great deal of history in the book. I wanted to trace how we got where we are, to establish the pedigree of fiscal issues as moral issues, and to remind people that our federal government has only recently become the intrusive behemoth that it is. But in addition to imparting information and providing, I hope, persuasive analysis and argument, I wanted to do something more. I wanted to help equip the citizens of the American Republic to evaluate economic and, by implication, other policy proposals for themselves. And so the book opens with a vision for fiscal reform. I'm trying to lift people's chins from their immediate concerns and encourage them to weigh public policy changes against the picture of the kind of society that they want to foster. Toward the end, it includes a section on the principles of fiscal reform, in which I attempt to pull together the lessons of previous chapters, but also to guide readers in how to apply them. And I've tried hard to make fiscal policy accessible to a popular audience. The book is written at a lay level, and it's liberally peppered with literary devices as well as humor, all intended to keep the reader engaged and confident that he can understand what many perceive as a fairly esoteric policy area. As I found out, one sure way to glaze people's eyes over at a party is to tell them you're writing a book on tax reform. So I've really tried to write in a style that keeps people reading and thinking about what they're reading. It's my hope that in this promising climate of renewed popular resistance to federal overreach, that my book will acquaint both Peter and Paul, as well as their elected representatives, with the moral rationale against wealth redistribution, that it will equip them as citizens to carefully consider the policies enacted by our republic, and that it will give them hope. Thanks for listening, and I think we have some time for questions. Thank you. No questions? Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go.
What inspired you to write the book?
Well, that's a great question. I've always, we've all heard how tax and spend policy, progressive taxation, is bad for the economy. It suppresses growth. But I always felt like there was a moral dimension, that it also diminishes virtue, that was being just under-considered. And since nobody else was writing a book on it, I decided that I would. No?
Yeah, I would just like you to share, I think it's on page 37, that quote from James Madison. It is just amazing. This could have been ripped from yesterday's headlines.
You'd think he actually knew something, wouldn't you?
Right at the bottom.
Yeah, okay. This is from Federalist 62. I wrote, Madison argued for the Constitution by making a compelling case for wise and stable government. Okay, again, this is Federalist paper number 62. Every nation whose affairs betray a want of wisdom and stability may calculate on every loss which can be sustained from the more systematic policy of its wiser neighbors. The internal effects of a mutable policy are still more calamitous. It poisons the blessings of liberty itself. It will be of little avail to the people that laws are made by men of their own choice if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood. If they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Law is defined to be a rule of action. How can that be a rule which is little known and less fixed? Mr. Madison thanks you. Any more questions? Yes.
Would you, for tax reform, would you consider that we should implement a fair tax? Have you looked into the fair tax?
Oh, I certainly have. The last section of the book is actually on the different kinds of tax proposals that are out there. I talk about the fair tax, the flat tax, the national sales tax, and I go through, as I mentioned in my talk, I try to give people some principles. And so I go through and I evaluate those different proposals based on the principles that I've talked about throughout the book. My book does not take a position in favor of one specific plan because I just think that that's getting a little bit ahead of the game. I'm nerd enough to be really looking forward to the day when we're having a robust public debate about whether we should have a national sales tax or a flat tax or a fair tax or whatever. But I don't think we're there yet. So my book was written to help people understand in a more full way why morally as well as economically we need to do something, why we need to reform our tax code. And then when we get more people on board with that and really understanding the philosophical reasons, then we can move ahead and talk about which plan. We've all seen with the bailouts and everything else what mischief happens when we just rush a plan through thinking, oh, we've got to do something, so we'll just do anything. And so I want not to contribute to that, but actually to keep it from happening any further. Yes?
Comment on the moral outcomes of the tax provisions in the proposed healthcare reform where they're doing penalties for not having health insurance, etc.
Well, nobody really knows what the proposed health reform will be because they're in closed doors talking about it right now. But yes, certainly some of the things that have been talked about, for instance, penalties if you don't make a certain amount of money for not having health insurance. Well, that again, as I talked about with things like the mortgage deduction and things like that, that's actually the government stepping into your moral decision-making process to decide what's best for you. They're saying, we know better than you what you need. And so if you're not going to buy what we tell you you have to buy because we've decided it's what you need, then you have to pay a fine. Okay, then there are the things that have been talked about, the candy taxes and the soda taxes and all that. Now, we have a long history of taxing commodities in this country, but taxes are for revenue. They're not for steering behavior. It is not the government's job to discourage us from eating candy or drinking sodas or beer or whatever through tax policy. It's our job as adults or as parents to guide children not to do those things or to do them in appropriate moderation. It's an invasion. It's an infantilization. It teaches people to rely on the government to make decisions for them rather than make them for themselves.
I got another one. I'm sorry, does anybody? It's all right. Keep going.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I was just going to say, one thing with the Tea Parties, I noticed all my life there's been a tendency to kind of relax about this kind of thing during Republican administrations, particularly if they have more than one branch of government. And yet I can think of some really stupid things promulgated domestically by Republican presidents, other than Ronald Reagan. Even some of those.
Well, I've often wondered, if the bailout had been proposed by a Democratic president, would it have gotten through? But unfortunately, there were an awful lot of Republicans carrying water for George Bush, pushing that thing through Congress last year when it was clear that the American people didn't want it, and it was equally clear, and becoming clearer every day, that it was simply bad policy. So I think we really need to move beyond this kind of, whatever my party chief says we do is something that we have to do, and thinking much more deeply the way our founders intended about every policy proposal that gets before Congress.
I was wondering if your book touched bases on the income tax situation. Prior to 1916, we haven't always paid income tax, and we talk about generating wealth for our country. It seems to me a lot has changed since the income tax has taken place. That means, basically taxing man on his labor. But I don't think that's in the Constitution, and however, it's a lot of big debate. So let's get back down to the real issue of how do we